Hello, I'm Klaus Mueller. I'll be presenting today a paper called Interactive Subspace Cluster Analysis Guided by Semantic Attribute Associations. That's research I did together with my former PhD student Salman Mahmood, who has since graduated. And we are both from Stony Brook University. Enjoy the show. So this paper deals with high-dimensional data. So what's high-dimensional data? It's any data set with many rows and many columns. There's like, these are the dimensions. The columns are the dimensions. There's usually more than 2 or 3 or 4. So what you do when you have so many dimensions or columns, you have to project them into 2D, because that's how you can visualize them. So as many options you have, there's principal component analysis, PCA, where you can construct a biplot that is shown on the right-hand side, or you can do multidimensional scaling, or you can do TSNE or UMAP. There's many others you can use. The one problem with those is, of course, is when you have too many dimensions and use this projection algorithm, that hides subtle patterns in the data. So basically they're overplotted. And what you really want to do is first want to isolate those structures within low-dimensional subspaces prior to projection. So I'll show you an example of this later. So when you think of a subspace, then that is really an ecosystem of subspace clusters, right? You think of the high-dimensional data set as an ecosystem of subspace clusters, and each subspace cluster can have a different attribute set. Then ideally, each attribute set is tuned to one specific data pattern, and then all the data is projected into any given subspace. So as an example here, you have a 3-dimensional data set, and you project it into 3 2-dimensional subspaces, where you can see each of these 2-dimensional subspace can isolate at least 2 patterns. The other one is not seen very well, but there's always 2 patterns that you can clearly see, 2 clusters that you can clearly see. Not in all of them, but in 2 of them here. On the right-hand side, you can't really see it. It's still overplotted. So let's show you an example of this to bring you home this idea of subspace clustering and what it can give you. So let's see this. Look at this image segmentation data set, which has 16 features or dimensions, and 5 image classes, which are grass, foliage, sky, and others. And if you take the whole 60D data space, perform a PCA, and project it into the 2 major principal component axes, then you get this kind of picture here, where you can clearly see that these classes that are in this data set are overplotted. They're basically intermixed. So you can't really see the individual classes at all. Basically all together in one single picture, but they're overlapped, okay? But if you use our algorithm, which is the semantic subspace analyzer, you can reduce the number of dimensions and then only project the data only in those subset of dimensions. And what you can see here, a 3-dimensional semantic subspace, for example, on the middle, has these classes really nicely isolated now, right? Before they were not, but now they're nicely isolated. Can really make out the grass, the cement, the foliage from one another. They're separated now. And on the right-hand side is a 5-dimensional subspace. It's what we call extended semantic subspace. We'll learn about this as well. Can isolate even better, almost optimally. So still preserving this ability of PCA to preserve the neighborhood relations, right? There's no distortion, it's all linearly projected, but now cleanly shown each pattern by itself. So there's a lot of subspace clustering algorithms. And actually, it's not trivial, right? It's actually pretty hard. So some algorithms that you probably heard of is Clique, surfing, and others. So what surfing does, it runs a bottom-up using heuristic search with a quality metric that has to be fulfilled. And it basically generates new subspaces from subspaces already known to be interesting. That grows the subspaces out in higher dimensions and then stops when the quality metric is fulfilled. The problem is that it generates an abundance of subspace because it creates a tree of subspaces, and then every branch looks pretty interesting and worth pursuing. In the end, you create an abundance of subspaces. For example, when you look at this Filipino family income and expenditure data set that you use later on for examples, it generates a whopping 2,011 subspaces. Only here, I only show here that the subspace that have greater or equal to 3 dimensions. And I ordered with Shakal distance, but you can see, how can you look at 2011 subspaces? There's no way you can explore all of them. And this is commonly known as subspace explosion. So you may have seen these pictures here before. These are all papers that try to provide some visual interface to manage this abundance of subspace. But you can see all of this is pretty daunting, right? Pretty daunting. It's really hard to really explore what is going on in your data, right? So our solution is what we call semantic subspace clustering. Basically, what it does, it organizes dimension into semantically meaningful themes first. So it doesn't just show you any arbitrary subspace, it shows you subspace that covers semantically meaningful themes. Okay, so you start out with these set of familiar subspaces and then involve them further by your brushing in one subspace and then taking whatever you brushed and project it to another subspace to learn about other relationships in that particular subspace. So it's like a sort of an interactive technique. And made a little block diagram for you to get to bring this home, what the system is all about, semantic subspace analysis. So we'll start out with the attribute labels on the right-hand side and some text, optional text that describes the attributes. You don't have to subscribe it, but sometimes it pays off. And on the left-hand side, we have general text and domain text possibly that could help explain these attributes. General text like Wikipedia, corpus, or something like this. And you take all this together and create a word embedding, a general word embedding, which is a high-dimensional space of words now. And you use Word2Vec. We use Word2Vec for this, but there's other techniques you can use. So now you have this general word embedding, high-dimensional embedding of all of these terms, attributes, and general text. And then what you do, you filter this word embedding, the general word embedding, by the attribute labels. Okay, so because we don't really want to visualize all of the words, we just want to visualize the words that go with the attributes. Okay, and then we create this attribute word embedding, which is a two-dimensional projection of these words. Like you can use MDS or something like this, like or TSN even, but MDS we use. Then you have basically representation of these words and only the attribute words, but they're now organized and structured by the general knowledge of the general text, okay? And then the user can go and manipulate this a little bit to define, with mouse interaction, define what we call conceptual attribute grouping. Like we have automatic grouping, but sometimes the grouping isn't perfectly accurate, and analysts can go and group them a little more. So now you have these groupings of words, attributes that have themes with them. And then once you have this grouping, you can take the data and project them into one of these groups, right? So that creates a semantic data subspace. And you can brush that now. You can highlight certain substructures that you like, and then take this and project into other semantic data subspace to figure out how these structures behave in another theme or another semantics, okay? And then you can go and take any subspace algorithm, like for example surfing, to extend those thematic subspaces further to discover like interesting relationships that don't go with the themes only, right? So basically now you venture out and see like if there's any other attribute that might be interesting in the context of these themes, and we call that the augmented semantic data subspace. Okay, so I make a little example for you. Okay, so let's take the Filipino income expenditures data set, which is basically about the income, how Filipinos make money and how they spend it. Okay, and then this is attributes that this data set has. And if you do this grouping, this semantic grouping with this Word2Vec algorithm, and then you cluster it afterwards. This is an MDS projection of this attribute space, and you cluster it. You can actually make out different groups of things here, right? So for example, the red ones up here, all food items like vegetables, tobacco, and meat and fruit and bread, cereals and rice. And on the left of it are our services, communications, transportation, education, medical care, special occasions, and so on. Then the below here are the utilities, electricity and agricultural. Then the bottom left are the electronics, computers, TVs, and so on. Then on the next to it are the appliances, stove, refrigerator. Then the bottom here is the transportation. On the right are things with the house, that go with the house and the family, okay, and income. So basically, it's really nice that you can already, just from using Word2Vec in the context of a domain data, you can now project the attributes in a thematic way, and you have like identify these semantic subspaces that way, right? So now show you this interface that we've constructed. On the left is this attribute visualization here, right? And on the top, you can basically, first of all, you can specify the number of subspaces that you would like to see. That controls the clustering in this display on the bottom here, right? The semantic grouping. And then you instead of the semantic grouping, you can take each of these groups and project the data into it, right? So now that you can label that, right? You can say, okay, this is the expenses, food expenses, and on the right is the electronic subspace, and then the bottom is the house subspace, right? You basically take these individual terms which form the dimension of the subspace, project the data into it, and then look at it that way, right? And then finally you can pick one of them and visualize it in more detail, and you make a biplot out of it here, right? So what you can see here is basically, this expenses and food subspace, and you can see a few trends here, right? You can see alcohol, meat, fruit, vegetable, pulp, tobacco, fish. They're all these kinds of dimensions also kind of grouped together in a correlated kinds of dimension group, right? And then here on the bottom you see bread, cereals, crop, and rice. They're also grouped in another group of dimensions, right? And so there's already clearly seen that there's like two prime trends, right? Like there's like these regular staples and then these basic staples on the bottom, right? So let's go, that's interesting, right? So now let's look at this a little closer, right? So for this part here, you can see this two-dimension clusters like the crop, bread, and rice are called the basic staples, pointing on the right lower corner, and the others, which are more luxurious food, pointing on the upper right corner, right? So now let's say, let's first distinguish them. Let's say, okay, I'm going to color all of those households. Each point is a household. Color all these households that are following more the basic staples that have more expenditures there. I color them magenta and call them basic staples group, and the others I leave at blue, right? And now let's go and say, okay, how about what are these basic staples group? What they're spending money in, for example, the services, right? What kind of money, what kind of services do they use, right? That's interesting, right? It's like market segmentation, okay? So that's the way you do this. You just basically project them in the expenses and services subspace, which we found before. And this is what we do here, right? So now we see these blue clusters. I make them a little less opaque, right? Make them more transparent. The interface has a utility for that. And so now to focus more on those magenta basic staple households. Okay, so what I see here, they don't really spend much on services, right? They spend a lot of money on medical care and special occasions like wedding, but not much. They're more focused on the middle, right? They don't really spend a lot there, right? They're more focused on the low expenditures on these kinds of services, right? And so let's see. Knowing that, right, let's see what kind of electronics they have and what kind of houses they have, right? So we can basically now take this brush data project them into these electronics owned and houses owned subspaces, right? And we'll do this next. But before we do this, we'll take these points that are really far out, right, and tag them in yellow to identify them as high spenders, right? These are the ones that spend a lot of money on housing, whatever, miscellaneous goods, medical care. They basically have high values in all of them, and we call them high spenders, and we mark them in yellow. And then we project them into this electronics-owned subspace and house-owned subspace. So the high spenders, they spend on the left-hand side, they have a lot of electronics, right? When you look at the CDs, computer, air conditioners and so on, they have all of them, right? So they're big spenders, they're the backbone of the economy. And then the basic staples households, they really don't owe much, right? They have very little things. They may, on the left-hand side, they have like cell phone, they have a little more cell phone expenditures, but that's about it, right? And then on the right-hand side, the houses, we'll see, they really spread around, right? But they're mostly the basic staples people. They tend to smaller houses, right? The houses that have only one bedroom and doesn't have big floor area. But then in terms of house age, they have it really depends. They're spread well over all of these, right? So that's like another insight we can get from this. And let's project it into the family subspace and see what kind of family these households have, right? So the yellow ones, we can see, the basic staples are more evenly distributed, right? They may have small family, large family, old family, young family. They're pretty much all over the place. But the high spenders, they're tend to more like smaller families, right? The head age is bigger, like they're trending more to the lower left corner. So basically, these are older families, right, with not a lot of members anymore, right? They have grown children and things like this, empty nesters. So what we can basically see from here, the overall finding is in Filipino families with less economic resources, rice, bread, cereal, and crops make up a major portion of the food consumption and the expenditures as well, right? So that's basically what we can get out of that. But that's not all, right? So let's see if there's some unexpected stuff going on, right? Something that is within the themes but beyond the themes. So we can use surfing to observe exterior influences, right? We can now add other dimensions using surfing, because surfing is an algorithm that will opportunistically find the best dimension that can further cluster a subspace, right? A further cluster subspace. So let's identify certain clusters, right? So we run surfing, and we'll find out what's very interesting on the bottom. We'll find interesting that there's like basically now the dimension electricity is being added, which comes from a utility subspace, right? We have the service subspace. Now we're adding electricity from the utility subspace. And actually, this has a really good effect, right? It's first of all, it's pretty orthogonal to the existing dimensions, right? And it has the ability to separate this big cluster here and actually isolate a cluster on the bottom, right? Basically, these are households that are not spending any electricity, right? Because they're all the way on the tail end of the electricity use, right? So by just using this dimension, but this is just one out of many dimensions, but surfing found the one that can really bring out something interesting. And then you look at the picture and interpret it and say, these are households that don't spend electricity. What about these households, right? So let's just color them yellow and see how they do, right? Well, how they behave in other subspace. For example, here, electronics owned, right? We'll see electronics owned. Basically, we'll see that these electricity-less households, right, the ones that don't use electricity, they're all the way on the left-hand side, right? They don't own any electronics because they don't have electricity, but they own cell phones, right? You can see that you own cell phones on the left-hand side. They're all in the cell phones area, right, up and down the dimension, which basically means cell phone is an essential device, right? You cannot do without a cell phone, without a mobile phone. You need it, right? So you find a way to charge it, but even if you don't have electricity at home. So that's another very interesting message. Interesting for market research, of course. Lots of people, for market research, so on, you kind of know what they still have, right? By using this algorithm, you can expose that. Okay, so let's discuss this. Okay, so I really like this quote: "Clustering is in the eye of the beholder" by Estevil Castro in KDD 2002. It really, a cluster can mean different things to many people, right? And people see different clusters just depending what they're interested in, right? So there isn't no hard and fast clustering algorithm, right? A cluster is a set of points that have some association, but there's lots of associations, as you can see in the subspace clustering algorithms, general ones, right? So somehow it's the clustering that you like and that you can make some sense of, right? That is the clustering that is in your eye, when you are the beholder, right? So basically, our tool aids analysts in the construction of a set of initial familiar subspace to get them started, which we call semantic themes. And I think in some sense, this is like an ideation tool, much like ChatGPT, right? Where you run it and you get a little bit of an idea of where to follow through, right? Where can you start, right? You don't start with a seed of thousands of subspaces. Instead, you'll have just a few of them and you're kind of familiar with them and you see some initial trends that you can sort of think about, and then you expand out and find new things that you didn't think about, right? So that's an ideation tool, right? So it serves as a starting point for deeper expanded subspace exploration, aided by this general subspace clustering techniques further down the line in this strategy. Of course, there's limitations. So now, first of all, you need meaningful attribute labels, and otherwise you can provide meta text that explain these labels, and we have done this in the paper. We can read about this. Then other thing is word2vec. We've used word2vec, which is somewhat an older technology, which has a conflation of word sense, meaning that two words that might have different meanings get mapped to the same point in the high-dimensional word space. You can use BERT, or large language models, to disambiguate this, okay, but the general principle still applies there as well. And the PCA display itself, when we make the biplot, right, it can have projection ambiguity. So maybe if there are too many meaningful dimensions in this PCA space, then you might, those clusters that might appear in a biplot might not really be clusters. Okay, so you want to always check the scree plot that kind of shows you the importance of the principal components and see if they really level off at after 2, right? You want to check that. And if they don't level off, you might want to break them up into 2 semantic subspaces, right? We have done this as well, right? Just break them up into 2, and then until you see that the scree plot behaves nicely. There's a lot more detail and more case studies in the paper, and you can just visit this webpage to read about this. Thank you.